Okay, so today we're doing something a little different. We're trying to get inside the head, maybe, of Tucker Carlson.
Right, a really prominent figure and definitely polarizing. Lots of strong opinions out there.
Exactly. And people feel strongly, positively, negatively. That's totally understandable.
Hmm.
But our goal here isn't really to say if those feelings are right or wrong. It's more to look past the usual headlines.
Yeah, to explore the views, the experiences, maybe even the emotions. Kind of see what's shaping his perspective.
We've got this really in-depth conversation he had recently. Covers a lot of ground. Global stuff,
Mm.
media, personal thoughts.
It's a chance to unpack things a bit, maybe understand what makes him tick, even if you don't agree with where he lands.
Definitely. And I think approaching it with like an open mind is key here. Trying to set aside the baggage if we can.
For sure, because understanding why someone with his platform thinks the way they do, well, that adds context, doesn't it? Even if the conclusions are controversial.
So let's start with something that jumped out at me. He said he was surprised that Putin seemed nervous during their interview.
Yeah, that was an interesting observation. Putin nervous.
And he contrasted it with himself, saying he wasn't nervous. And his reasons were kind of personal, his age, kids grown up, his faith.
What do you make of that? Putin being nervous, I mean,
Uh,
could be anything, right? Maybe the less controlled setting, or maybe it was even strategic, appearing vulnerable?
Could be. And Carlson's own explanation for his calmness, age, faith, suggests a certain, maybe personal confidence,
Hmm.
or feeling like he's seen a lot already.
Yeah, a kind of grounding. Which maybe ties into what he said next, about being really struck by the history of the Kremlin.
Oh, right. Being in Molotov's old office, he seemed almost overwhelmed by that, the history of the place.
It was like the historical weight was almost more fascinating to him than the immediate interview subject.
Yeah, exactly. That fascination with history, it does seem like a recurring thing for him.
It points to this like intellectual curiosity beyond just the day-to-day politics, wanting to connect current events to this longer historical arc.
Okay, let's shift to Ukraine, a huge topic, obviously. He said his main goal was just bringing more information to the West.
Right, so people could make up their own minds. He really pushed back on the idea that Americans should just, quote, shut up and obey the official line on U.S. involvement.
So that stance, what does it tell us about his core thinking?
Well, it definitely highlights a belief in, like, individual autonomy, critical thinking. He seems very skeptical of any kind of forced consensus.
Wants people to chew on the information themselves.
Exactly. A more informed public, or at least a public that questions things more. That seems to be the driver.
He also got into the specifics of the military situation, pointed to Russia's larger population industrial capacity.
Yeah, the artillery shell production comparison was stark. He cited a huge difference there.
And he mentioned talking to Victor Orban, Hungary's leader, who apparently was pretty dismissive of Ukraine's chances of winning.
So he's using these data points, these other leaders' perspective, to build his case about the realities on the ground as he sees them.
The artillery point is significant, isn't it, in that kind of warfare?
Oh, absolutely. Rate of fire, sustained barrages, it matters hugely.
Right.
And referencing Orban adds that layer of, like, here's what regional leaders think.
He also brought up the sanctions potentially hurting the U.S. dollar's status.
Mm-hmm. Connecting the conflict back to tangible economic consequences for the U.S., which is a recurring theme for him.
And then, maybe surprisingly for some, he expressed sadness about Navalny's death.
Right, and a general opposition to jailing political opponents.
So you've got the economic argument and then this statement on, like, basic rights.
Yeah.
How do those fit together in his view?
It shows it's not just one thing, right? It's multifaceted. The dollar concern is pragmatic, American interest-focused. The Navalny comment suggests maybe a baseline belief against political persecution, regardless of who it is.
Interesting. He also made an observation about Moscow itself not seeing a big Putin personality cult compared to other places he's visited.
Yeah, that lack of overt, like, posters everywhere or something.
And he talked about his own feeling of freedom as an American to just go and do the interview, even though lawyers apparently warned him about coming back.
Right, despite the potential blowback.
And he wanted to show support for Julian Assange, too, believing he was railroaded.
So the common thread there seems to be, what? A belief in challenging norms, free speech, pushing boundaries.
Maybe all of the above. His own identity as an American journalist, maybe, feeling he should be able to talk to anyone, despite the risks, and aligning with figures like Assange who also challenge power.
Okay, let's pivot to media and government. This is a big area for him. He basically said a lot of U.S. media is just state media.
Strong words, serving the government's interests in his view.
And he brought up the NSA, claiming they monitor everything and saying it's totally unacceptable for intelligence agencies to meddle in elections or information flow.
So it paints a picture of pretty deep distrust, doesn't it? Towards both mainstream media and government institutions.
Absolutely. A real skepticism about power structures and the potential for abuse, the surveillance, the election interference concerns. It feeds into that.
He even said something like, anyone who seeks power is damaged morally.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty sweeping statement.
And that you should judge leaders by the fruits of their behavior, not just their personality. Concrete results.
Right, actions over words. Which ties into how he discussed Black Lives Matter too, focusing on what he saw as its measurable impact.
It's a very pragmatic, maybe cynical view of power and people in charge. Focus on the outcomes.
Yeah, less about intentions, more about what actually happened.
Okay. One of the most talked about parts was his impression of Moscow. He said it was cleaner, safer, more orderly than any major U.S. city.
That really seemed to hit him. No graffiti, no homeless camps, no public drug use, he said. Tidiness, even the architecture, less oppressive modern stuff.
And he sounded genuinely frustrated. Like, why have Americans lowered their expectations for their own cities?
You can really hear the emotion there, can't you? It's less about praising Moscow, maybe, and more a critique of the U.S.
Yeah, disappointment, maybe even anger that things aren't better here. A kind of longing for a standard he thinks has been lost.
Like, cleanliness and safety shouldn't be opposed to freedom, he argued, recalling a time when the U.S. supposedly had both.
Then he made that really controversial comparison, saying the U.S. has more central planning than Russia.
Right, pointing to things like the climate agenda or the power of big tech monopolies like Google.
How should we even interpret that? Because central planning usually means something very specific economically.
Exactly. He seems to be using it differently. More like significant government direction in certain sectors, plus the huge influence of massive corporations shaping things.
So not state ownership of everything, but powerful forces, government and corporate, steering the ship in ways he finds excessive.
Yeah, that seems to be his point. That these forces are maybe distorting the U.S. economy and society, maybe even more than direct state control does in Russia, in his view. He wants a return to something more sensible and moderate.
Okay, shifting again. Truth and perception. He was really down on the internet. Wikipedia as reliable sources.
Emphasized going and seeing things for yourself. Direct personal observation.
He said he felt hoodwinked by the mainstream story about Russia.
Right, and encouraged people to travel, experience things firsthand.
He even admitted to having held bigoted views about Slavic people or Muslims in the past, blaming media influence.
So that suggests a real personal evolution, or at least a conscious shift away from relying on secondary sources he now distrusts.
Yeah, a journey towards firsthand experience as the ultimate validator of truth for him, leading to some disillusionment.
And that connects to his view of Jon Stewart, maybe, another media figure.
Oh yeah, he was pretty dismissive. Called Stewart unhappy, deeply partisan.
Recalled their old Crossfire dust-up, felt it wasn't the big Stewart win everyone claimed.
And his main criticism now is that Stewart has become a defender of power.
Right. Doesn't challenge the establishment on big things like, say, Ukraine aid. Carlson argued he himself is actually less partisan than Stewart.
So the core of it seems to be who's truly independent, who's willing to critique power wherever it lies.
Exactly. Carlson seems to see Stewart as having joined the establishment he once mocked. There's a fundamental disagreement there about what a media figure's role should be.
Okay, back to the Ukraine war specifics.
Yeah.
He hopes for a negotiated settlement, compromise on both sides.
And he found it significant that Putin didn't bash Biden or NATO in the interview.
He read that as a sign Putin might actually want a deal.
That seemed to be his interpretation, yeah. That Putin's main goal is just keeping NATO missiles off his border.
And Carlson himself said if he were president, he'd pull the U.S. out of NATO. Doesn't think it serves U.S. sovereignty.
That's a clear foreign policy stance. He also felt Zelensky has been completely misused by the U.S. State Department and others.
But he wasn't buying Putin's justification for the war either. Called the whole denazification thing one of the dumbest things I'd ever heard.
Right. Saw it as just a way to label enemies as evil and a misunderstanding of nationalism.
So his overall vision for Ukraine seems to be diplomatic solution, address Russia's core security concerns, as he defines them, rethink NATO, stop using Zelensky, and ignore the ideological justifications.
That sums it up pretty well. A very distinct take, skeptical of the current Western approach.
He also reflected more broadly on power. Leaders in charge too long get weird and autocratic. Hence, term limits are good.
Mm-hmm. A general wariness of entrenched power.
And he expressed a kind of weariness with journalists generally. Doesn't want to become like them,
Yeah.
citing perceived flaws.
Interesting self-reflection there, given his profession.
He doubled down on Putin being open to negotiation, mentioned Russia trying to join NATO in the past.
Right, bringing up historical context to support the idea that cooperation was or is possible.
And again, blaming the U.S. State Department for potentially blocking peace. Very critical of figures like Nikki Haley, the whole foreign policy establishment. Sees a long track record of failure there.
So the common theme again is this deep distrust of the established players and institutions, right? Foreign policy, journalism, long-term leaders. He sees them as prone to self-interest, groupthink, and failure.
And that maybe alternative paths, like talking directly with adversaries, are being ignored because of these institutional flaws.
That seems to be the implication.
Okay, let's touch on some more personal reflections he shared. He's aware of the dangers of fame, says he has rituals to avoid becoming an asshole.
Okay, self-awareness there.
And he voiced some pretty deep concerns about technology's impact.
Yeah, citing things like falling birth rates, rising suicide rates, mentioning South Korea, specifically the fentanyl crisis.
He questioned if major tech advances in the last 20 years have actually made lives conclusively better. Are people more informed now than before the internet? He doubts it.
That's a big question. He also wondered why modern buildings often lack the beauty of, say, old cathedrals built before electricity.
Right, and expressed strong opposition to nuclear weapons, and especially to using tech to permanently change the human brain.
So these reflections, they suggest a real unease with the direction of modern society, don't they?
Definitely. A skepticism about progress for its own sake. An appreciation for older forms of beauty, maybe connection, human experience.
A concern for fundamental human well-being getting lost in the shuffle of rapid change.
He also talked about leadership qualities, caring for the people you lead and physical courage being essential.
Mm-hmm. And he used examples, criticized George W. Bush for leaving D.C. on 9/11.
But contrasted that with Zelensky staying in Kiev at the start of the war.
So for him, leadership means responsibility, presence, bravery, standing with your people in a crisis. That seems paramount.
And there was the text message about Donald Trump, where he said he passionately hated him.
Right. That caused a stir. How did he explain that?
He linked it to frustration right after the 2020 election. Disappointment with the result, and maybe with the information or lack thereof coming from the Trump campaign about the alleged fraud.
Okay, so frustration in that specific moment. But he still maintains the election was stolen.
Yeah, he believes it was 100% stolen, citing changes to voting rules due to COVID.
And he sees Trump's indictment as purely political, an attempt to take out a candidate.
That was his take. Undermining democracy, he argued. So it's a complex picture there with Trump. Intense frustration expressed privately, but public defense against what he sees as political persecution and belief in election fraud.
It definitely shows the intensity of his feelings about 2020 and the political dynamics around Trump.
He also slipped in that he once applied to the CIA himself.
Oh, really? Interesting bit of personal history.
But yeah, clearly feels strongly against intelligence agencies interfering in U.S. democracy now.
That personal note adds a layer to his general suspicion of those agencies' domestic roles, a fundamental objection to crossing that line.
Finally, he got really fundamental, talked about the absolute importance of family.
And he was critical of feminism's impact on relationships, on young people forming families.
He argued the whole point of life is to create, and that children are the purest form of creation.
That's a very traditional perspective. He also noted that lots of wealthy people seem unhappy.
Right. A disconnect between material wealth and actual fulfillment.
And he reflected on his own biggest success, his marriage, saying it wasn't just his doing, believes in larger forces acting on people.
Unseen forces, yeah. And he mentioned admiring Sheikh Mohammed of Abu Dhabi as the greatest leader he's met.
Why him specifically?
Because, Carlson said, the Sheikh is constantly aware of his own limitations and relies on divine guidance. Humility, essentially.
So putting those final pieces together, family, creation as purpose, skepticism of wealth, belief in larger forces, admiration for our humble leadership, it paints a picture of his core values.
Yeah, very much centered on traditional structures, maybe a spiritual dimension, and a distrust of purely material or individualistic pursuits.
So when you step back from all these different threads, what's the overall picture of Tucker Carlson that emerges from this conversation?
Well, you definitely see someone driven by Intense curiosity, I think, but also deep frustration with the state of America, its cities, its institutions.
A sense of decline, maybe?
Yeah, and a real concern for what he sees as fundamental values. Family, freedom, his definition of it, maybe even beauty and order.
And a profound distrust of established power, whether it's government, media, or even tech giants.
Exactly. So whether you end up agreeing with any of his conclusions or strongly disagreeing, digging into the conversation reveals more about the person behind the public figure.
The experiences, the emotions, the intellectual framework, it gives you more context for understanding why he argues what he argues.
Right. It's about understanding the human element driving this really significant voice in our public conversation today, looking beyond just the sound bites.
It shows a complex person wrestling with big issues, interpreting them through his own lens, often with strong emotions attached.
Definitely encourages you to think more deeply about all these issues yourself, maybe examine your own assumptions.
A useful exercise, regardless of where you stand politically.
See you soon.